Broadcast is live. All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you all for joining us, everyone who's here. And for those who are going to view later, welcome. My name is Kirsten Midura. I'm one of the Toronto Motorcycle Film Festival judge panelists, and I am the founder of Engines for Change. We're an organization that mobilizes motorcyclists to get them involved in charitable causes and educates motorcyclists on what's happening right now in the world. So coming from a background in nonprofit work, I was really pleasantly surprised to see one particular film this year that used the premise of motorcycling to talk about some real hard-hitting issues happening in the world right now. Best Man Corner is one of the most unique motorcycle films that I personally have seen come through the motorcycle festival circuit, and the film's director is just as interesting. So this film looks into the lives of motorcycle taxi riders in Monrovia, which is the capital of war-torn Liberia. There are more than 175,000 motorcycle taxi drivers operating in Liberia, and many of these are either former child soldiers or conflict-affected youth who lost out on economic and educational opportunities because of Liberia's civil wars. So the film's director is a senior lecturer in the School of International Relations at University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He is a well-published author on post-conflict transitions after civil war, including a 2013 book on the reintegration of former fighters in civil society in 4 African states. He has written reports on these topics for the United Nations Department of Peace Operations. He has his doctorate in international relations from the University of Oxford, and he has now added to his extensive accomplishments the crowning feather in his cap of being a motorcycle filmmaker. So a huge thank you and warm welcome to director Jaremey McMullin.
Thanks so much for having me, Kirsten, and hello to everyone who may be watching now or later. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. So there are so many places that we can go with this conversation and topic, and we will get to them. But to start, let's just start with the film itself. So how did this project originally come about for you?
Yeah, this has been a project I've wanted to do for a while. So Liberia is a place where I'd spent a fair bit of time before doing a couple of the United Nations reports that you mentioned, and a place where I'd done some research into ex-combatant reintegration. So when I was in Liberia in 2007 and 2009, motorcycle taxing had just started to enter into Liberia. And at the time, I already was remarking on how successful it was economically in terms of producing a large number of jobs for young people to be able to get by in a post-war country where not a lot of opportunities were available otherwise. But I was also struck by some of the language that the international development world sometimes used to speak about the cyclists. That was often negative and pejorative, that focused exclusively on how motorcycling was a focus point of threat, particularly because it drew on so many former fighters. And this would have been kind of the first generation of motorcycle taxi drivers, so they would have been adult ex-combatants during the war. So already from that period of time, I thought this is a dynamic I want to explore, because I suspect, based on some of my other work on ex-combatants, that there was a bit of stigmatization and fear-mongering that was happening around the sector, and that some of its contributory elements were escaping the attention of people in this community. And I guess, always dreamed of this project in visual terms too, but lacked the skills in the background. So just thought, as soon as I have the opportunity, I want this to be a project that I film. I think for all of you motorcycle enthusiasts and hobbyists, you know what, and you're into motorcycle films, you know what a visual and motion kind of based medium this activity can be, regardless of whether it's as your job for a motorcycle taxi driver or as a hobby. It's something that it just kind of lends itself to film. So, mainly through serendipity, through a close friend of mine that I started to develop a good friendship with over the years, who's a cinematographer for the project, Matthew Heineman. He was willing to come to Liberia at basically just research assistance levels of pay. And we were lucky enough to get a grant from the Scottish Funding Council to do this project. And so that brought Best Man Corner to life.
That's awesome. That's such a unique story. And I think that everybody who's probably part of this festival or watching would agree with the visual medium motorcycles lending themselves to visual mediums. So, so I just want to back up a little bit. I mean, I'm familiar with Liberia and a little bit of the history, but there may be some people out there who are not. Can you just explain a little bit about where is Liberia? What is the history? What is the Civil War, the two Civil Wars all about? And what is it like today?
So Liberia is a country that I love a lot. It's in West Africa. It's situated, it borders Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. It's located on the coast. It's a country with a long and difficult history. It's often referred to as one of only two countries that has been consistently independent in Africa's history as a continent, the other one being Ethiopia. But that status is pretty misleading because Liberia was a country that was independent only in the sense that it was founded by freed, mostly American slaves from the United States, who, when they reached Liberia, often used both the same economic and the same socio-political tactics to control the population. Namely, they instituted a plantation-based economy, enslaved and or exploited or oppressed the indigenous Liberian population, wow, which basically started cycles of violence and oppression that lasted up until about 1980, when indigenous Liberians revolted, overthrew the Americo-Liberian elite who had dominated the country, but who still dominate in lots of ways, economically and socially. And from 1980 onwards, Liberia has then had a whole series of violent conflicts and civil wars, culminating in two civil wars that maybe some North American audience might be familiar with, that involved Charles Taylor, the former leader of Liberia. So the first one lasting through most of the 90s, from about 1989 to 1997. And then Charles Taylor was able to come to power. But cycles of oppression continued, again, just shifting kind of axes rather than Americo-Liberian elite and indigenous Liberian, more from an ethnic and regional base or political affiliation. So two armed groups formed in the late 1990s to oust Charles Taylor from power in the hopes of gaining more equity and security for all Liberians. And that was a very violent civil war that ended in 2003 in a negotiated settlement and an interim transitional government, which then ultimately led to the first election of a female leader on the African continent, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So that's basically its history. It also meant that there were a number, tens of thousands of combatants from both more recent civil wars that most Liberians see as one continuous war. And they tend to have very different nomenclature to refer to those wars, using language about World War I, World War II, and World War III that coincide with periods of violence experienced by them, especially in the capital city. So the United Nations was in Liberia for close to 2 decades and instituted a whole series of programs to reintegrate former soldiers, most of which focus around very short-term assistance, cash-based assistance, and pretty ineffective vocational training. So in that sense, we can look at motorcycle taxi riding as kind of a self-made sector and a sector that has provided much more longer-term results and opportunities for the individuals who practice it, which is not to discount the challenges, which I think we'll get to later too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a very rich and complex history of that country. Why? And I know that this film is part of a 5-part series of, different films focusing on different demographics, but why did the motorcycle taxi riders pique your interest in the first place?
So in part because of my background in studying ex-combatants. So, and Liberia is not unique on the African subcontinent. in terms of the motorcycle taxi industry's history with civil war. In quite a few other countries, I think maybe you guys even had a film in your festival last year that featured Ugandan riders, but I'm not quite sure. But anyway, in Uganda, in Sierra Leone, in Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Guinea, and a few other countries, motorcycle taxing is very wrapped up in the Civil War history, primarily because of the post-war giving of cash assistance to ex-combatants. Meaning that after war ends, ex-combatants, in Liberia at least, were some of the few individuals that had access to cash resources and chose to invest those resources, especially the leaders who received more cash resources, in fairly cheap Chinese-made models of motorcycle. And those then became the motorcycle taxis. There were early generations of them. There were almost more like scooters that Liberians refer to as pen. And then over time, some of the Honda models and other models, and don't ask me too many questions on the technical side of the machine itself. That's where you'll.
Right, we have other experts for that.
You'll make, yeah, exactly. You guys are the experts in that part. I'll try to fill in the socio-political blanks
Perfect.
for those that ride. So, their leaders then basically started doing what Liberians refer to as ride for pay. So they would lease these bikes to younger riders, usually, also who were normally maybe their child soldiers in their units, who would drive these cycles as motorcycle taxi, report money back to their former leaders. That's partly why it concerned some political leaders and folks in the international development world, because of course they were concerned about whether abusive relationships were persisting. And in many cases they were and are. It could be an economic exploitative arrangement. So the goal for a lot of the motorcyclists is to make enough money so that they can buy their own bike and ride, and then maybe from there buy other bikes and become entrepreneurs themselves that lease those bikes to their friends or to others. And that's when the real opportunities start to accrue. Otherwise, most motorcyclists tend to refer to it not as a career, but as something that they do just to have what they often refer to as daily bread, to subside, to eke out a living in harsh circumstances. But a surprising number have also been able to save money in community savings accounts, often organized by motorcycle taxi rank kind of collectives, and to put that money towards their schooling. One individual that I interviewed for a separate film project that I'm working on is very famous in motorcycle taxi communities because he was able to use motorcycle taxing to get an undergraduate degree from the University of Liberia. So when I traveled around the country, individuals would often kind of leverage him and mention him kind of aspirationally. But
what's his name? So that
his name's Emmanuel Sarti, and he goes by Sarti. So something that might become clear if you watch the film is that motorcycle taxi riders often tend to go by riding names, so names that they take on, nicknames that they refer to each other by.
That's not specific to them. That's a very motorcycle thing to do.
Yeah, cool. I mean, it's always really cool for me to find out like what things kind of carry over. But of course, that's also a thing that happens in war, that people take on a nom de guerre or a name that they assume during wartime. But it's interesting that the cyclists, although they were ex-combatants, they don't use their nom de guerre as their riding name. They take on a new riding name. So in that, I think it does mimic kind of motorcycling hobbyist communities where nicknames are given. And sometimes those nicknames could be as simple as, this person's a little bit portly, so he is known as Bor Belly. Or this person rides recklessly, so he's known as Killer B. And in the film, I think, yeah, okay. And in the film, then I think one of the main focal individuals, Edwin. I knew from the moment I met him that I wanted to focus on him for this particular project, just because of his ability to articulate, I think, the ups and downs in the sector and embodies it in giving himself a name that, as hustler, that embodies the nature of motorcycling as an activity.
Right. So yeah, actually that brings up another question that I had, which was how out of the 175,000 motorcycle taxi operators in Liberia, how did you pick which ones you wanted to focus on as characters?
Yeah, and that I should put a slight asterisk on that number. Of course, it's hard to do. Some censuses have taken place, and they often will range between 75,000 and 100,000. I prefer the 175,000 number because that captures even more marginal individuals that don't always have access to a motorcycle, but maybe occasionally ride the motorcycle of their brother, their uncle, whoever, as a way to just make a little bit of money to keep their family going and to put food on their table. And that's something that the motorcycle unions point out, is that often the government official statistics and tallies don't capture that level of precarity. In terms of like choosing to focus on particular individuals, it was an interesting journey for me to navigate having a research background, which I think was often a plus, but sometimes could be a minus for filmmaking, where then I often found myself being reluctant to make kind of what I consider sometimes some harsh choices.
We
And
call it killing your darlings.
yeah, also not just killing your darlings, well, but deciding which subjects to focus in on, sometimes for pretty
Right.
ruthless reasons too, that are visual or that are narrative, and that might lead us down certain paths, and we don't know what we'll miss otherwise. The researcher in me maybe thinks like some of these quieter or more subtle stories are the ones that we can write well, but maybe not tell very effectively or concisely, especially in a 20-minute film. But the main criteria, and Edwin's a really interesting one, because for the most part, and I did have about 6 key informants across the project, one of whom is the focus of another film in the short series, if anyone's interested, called Pink Panther. And her name is Katie, and she's one of only 10 female writers out of the 175,000. So for me, in terms, Edwin stands out because he was actually on the shy side, and has this quiet demeanor that I found really compelling. Whereas the other key informants, I tended to migrate towards them because of their particularly braggadocious or outgoing or really humorous personalities. But there's something also about Edwin's ability to, he doesn't just embody hustling, he narrates it. And he narrates it in really theoretically and conceptually rich ways that I think translate across cultures. And I just kind of marveled at that. In addition to the fact that of the 80 or so cyclists that I interviewed and filmed as part of the project, he was one of the youngest in terms of his conflict background. I think, what does he say in the film, that he was 6, 7, or 8 when he started fighting. So at a very young age, was recruited into what was called the anti-terrorist unit, which is one of the militia forces associated with Charles Taylor during the Civil War.
Yeah, that actually, that also brings up another question I have, which is, we talk about the ex-combatants on either side of the Civil War. Are the people within this motorcycle taxi community from the same side, or are they from different sides?
Completely different sides. So it's really interesting how that factional alignment really makes no difference in terms of taxi ranks now. And that's something that I knew back in 2009 was something that some of the international folks that were worried about the cycling springing up and being this uncontrolled. Motorcyclists, I think, are also really familiar with these stigmatizing discourses too, right? That the speed, the danger, that these kind of activities also color how people see the riders themselves. And it's no different in that context, but then you also add Civil War. Of course, you may or may not know that motorcycling communities also have a post-war context in North America, coming out of World War II and veterans feeling isolated and alienated from main communities. So I think I'm fascinated in the parallels, and think but basically that I think that they misunderstood that, these chains of command are being replicated in these taxi ranks. And that really hasn't ever been the case. And especially as this new generation has moved in, that also incorporates more and more conflict affected youth rather than child soldiers alone. But even in kind of motorcycle taxing 1.0 in Liberia, there was always factional cooperation. And what tends to be the deciding point about why you ride where has to do with trust and proximity and kind of more social ties that grow up around in kind of the post-war context. So yeah, that's something that I'd ask about, and it's kind of that intangible. Maybe that also exists in your world about who you decide to go out on the weekend with, and
Right.
it's both random but also a bit intangible and left unarticulated, but basically seems to boil down to trust and the social.
Absolutely. And kind of speaking from a North American motorcycling context, you tend to find people within the riding community that are like-minded, that you have the same values and the same goals. And then also people, as you're talking about trust, people that you trust to ride with, because it's a dangerous sport. And we all know it. We all go into it knowing it. And you want to ride with people who ride at the same pace, with the same style, want to go to the same places. But, with a lot of the events that we've been putting on over the last few years, especially, motorcycling is a universal, common area for those who ride. So it's a universal point of bonding and collaboration. And so it's really interesting to me to see that is not only universal among, riders in North America, riders, even in Europe and whatnot, Australia, but then also riders in sub-Saharan Africa. It's equally a unifying force over there as well, even in post-war conflict, which is, astounding. I'm going to pause really quickly my questions, because we do have a question from the audience. So Caius, let me know what that is. When you approached the writers about the creation of this film, what was their reaction? That's a really good question.
So yeah, almost really, Liberia can be, as a lot of post-conflict context can be, a little bit skeptical of outsiders, a little bit skeptical of a camera. And news crews, in particular, in the Civil War, post-Civil War context, that came in, extracted information, and then leave. So there was some initial groundwork to do about, which is true of any research project, in terms of explicating main objectives clearly and transparently. But from there, given that general skepticism about being filmed, which we encountered usually from bystanders who were maybe in the completely out of frame sometimes. And there are the individuals that would then storm up, sometimes get the police involved. And we were lucky to have a really good local Liberia-based research assistant who's trained in conflict management techniques and terrific at getting us out of jams, including one time when my cinematographer was accused of filming a man who was relieving himself against a tree. And the man accused us of filming that kind of film. So there were some jams to get out of it, but it's interesting that those were always from random people, bystanders. In terms of the taxi ranks, I think that it helped that I could speak the language a bit about ambivalence, by which I mean their location and identity in between opportunity and challenge, in between something that they're proud of and that they see as contributing to a peaceful Liberia, but something that doesn't get recognized as that. And that I was able to articulate that was my interest, articulate that this was about, that I couldn't promise much more than just sharing the story with whoever I can get to watch it. But that said, and if there's time, I'd love to talk more about the kind of follow-up projects we've been able to do to support the motorcycle taxi rider since, in part also because of these films. So it's been a really powerful tool, including to use with, bilateral donors in the development world, or the UN when we screened Pink Panther for the British permanent mission of the Security Council. These kind of open up new ways of seeing and thinking that have then led to some tangible investment in the sector. But so that's kind of an answer of we feel like we lucked out, but also benefited from incredible support from a Platform for Dialogue and Peace, which is a local, national NGO in Liberia that works on peace building using participatory action methods and community inclusion methods. And they were the ones that provided research support that was invaluable in terms of that first approach. From there, we always knew we were on the right track. And I kind of wish maybe I had edited some of these in to the film, but they don't always work. But whenever I would ask a question that would really resonate with one of the cyclists, there would always be an emphatic thank you. And just the intonation that says, that's the question that I want to be asked and that I have not been asked, or that I don't tend to be asked. And so we always knew, and others are also listening. They're often gathering around. They're hearing that exchange, and in turn, that built a sense of we are pursuing similar objectives, and our objectives are meshing. So it's also nice as an interviewer to get that kind of feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there, I mean, and spoiler alert, everyone go watch the film, but is there any one of those questions that really sticks out in your mind as like, that is one that everybody wanted to be asked, or that really, really stuck?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that I just had this natural ability, marching into the first encounter. And it's always in any research or probably filmmaking endeavor. I think these issues undergo a massive process of translation. But so something that stands out in particular is a question that became, writing together, what do you get? But that maybe started out with my researcher hat on is, talk to me about the socially reintegrative benefits of motorcycling. And that question would just fall flat. And then over time, we stumbled on to writing together, what do you get? And that, although it sounds maybe to our Anglo-American ears as maybe overly transactional, it actually opened up so much space for conversation about the social and about trust and about friendship in ways that I wasn't expecting. And then the other one that I always got to thank you was, sometimes people say terrible things about the cyclists. What do you think? And that became the translated version of questions that I was interested in exploring about social marginalization and stigmatization, and about misrecognition, about a group of individuals being engaged in a livelihood activity that they see as peace building, but that others, including Liberian passengers and elites, see as threat. So that was really generative as well.
That's, it's funny because you're talking about saying that to an interviewee and having them really have that resonate. But even just me, I have that resonate a lot. A lot of the reason why I started Engines for Change is because we get stigmatized as writers. We're the troublemakers, and there's a whole long history of marketing and, just Jesus, you know what I'm saying? And, you're talking about post-war conflict, and a lot of that did come from World War I, World War II. I mean, even the US has a really interesting history, and that's just built up over time. So when you say that actually also resonates for me, because I'm like, well, that's a stigma that I don't relate to. I don't think that I am this crazy troublemaker who's out causing problems on the streets with my motorcycle. Like, I'm using it to do social good. And I think obviously these individuals are as well. So that also is something that translates across borders, across the ocean. And that's pretty amazing to hear that you're doing that. I would actually like to address the concept of reintegration and peace building and stigmatization. So you have stated that these, especially young motorcyclists, motorcycle taxi riders, are peace building from the ground up, despite their actual, how people view them. What exactly does that mean? What is peace building?
So yeah, I kind of take, and this is something that, I've also started to write about a little bit more and been thinking about a lot. I try to use their language as a departure point. So something that I love about Edwin in Best Man Corner is his language, the language he uses around hustling. And hustling is a necessity in a difficult environment to make a living. Hustling is an art that he understands himself as doing particularly well. but that maybe he wouldn't be doing if he had other choices, that he'd maybe prefer to be a mechanic. I think he articulates that aspiration. But something that still contributes, and particularly hustling to kinds of activities, motorcycle taxiing being one of them, are the very activities that tend not to be recognized as contributions. So I took as a departure point cyclists' own articulations about their contributions. First and foremost, that's an economic contribution. Which peace building activities generate 175,000 jobs in a post-war context where few opportunities, economic opportunities exist, especially for individuals that lack educational qualifications. They are sometimes refer to themselves as the new youth entrepreneurs of Liberia, the engine of the economy, which also leverages kind of a motorcycle metaphor. And I believe that's true. In addition to the 175,000 of them, there are also something like 10 to 20,000 task force members who are kind of the self-governing policing arm of the motorcyclist unions, who are an attempt to reduce police brutality and exploitation. So a force that comes in if there's a traffic violation or a safety violation, or if there's a grievance to reconcile, they're kind of the first port of call. And so that's also a really interesting employment opportunity that's been generated that has also coincidentally built peace, because it's designed to reduce conflict, tension, and violence, in this case between police and young people engaged in motorcycling. And a very large percentage of young men in society are engaged in motorcycling. The next would be, and this is also something that started to change the public perception of cyclists as well, was the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in the 2010s. Motorcyclists, incidentally, another contribution is the connective work they do in a post-conflict context. They connect communities. They bring women to the markets and and their goods to sell at the market. They connect communities that are otherwise impassable because of the way in which conflict destroyed infrastructure, or the way in which the rainy season destroys infrastructure. Part of that connectivity then means they're also spreading information. So they were on the front lines in terms of spreading information about how to prevent the spread of Ebola, and building trust in some of the medical information that otherwise some rural communities in particular were predisposed to distrust. They were also the only individuals who were willing to touch Ebola patients and transport them to treatment centers when other people would not transport them to treatment centers, and it was perceived as too dangerous. But the cyclists had undergone training, and it was thanks in part to some collaboration from international donors too, that recognized that pretty quickly. An important thing to do would be to train cyclists in terms of protective gear. So, I mean, you might start to hear some resonances too.
This entire conversation resonates.
With the coronavirus and with COVID, that before we knew about, we like to think that we're smarter medically, we're from developed, quote unquote, developed countries. The cyclists were trained a very long, over 10 years ago, in some things that we're just picking up on: face masks, protective gear. And granted, Ebola is actually more difficult to transmit, but also much more deadly when it is transmitted. So the stakes are much higher to observe these rules. So protective equipment, hand washing, sanitizer, and the like. So they were also spreading these messages, protecting themselves, and able to make a living, because Ebola was devastating to all sorts of industry, just like COVID has been for so many countries in terms of commerce. They were able to continue to ride and to generate income because they were trained, and because they trained each other and learned. And then finally, I think socially, they build networks, and they're politically engaged, and they voted en masse for the same candidate, the ex-footballer George Weah, in the most recent presidential election. They transported people to polling stations where otherwise they wouldn't be able to reach polling stations. They transported votes to counting stations. These various roles are starting to be recognized, even though the overriding vibe is still largely about these young wayward youth as troublemakers, as just riding for fast cash so they can buy drugs and go stay out late partying, when the vast majority of them are trying to counter that and with messages like, I ride to survive, I ride to support my family, and I ride so that I can afford to finish my schooling.
This is amazing. And I also understand that there, and maybe you encountered this, maybe you didn't, but there are a few nonprofits over there who actually transport, like AIDS medication, Ebola, the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, via motorcycle out to clinics in rural Africa that can't access it otherwise. And you were talking a little bit about weather in the wet season, and that's just something that, over here where we have a pretty solid infrastructure for the most part, we don't necessarily think about access and infrastructure, and how simple things like, an entire season of rain can really impact a lot of communities who don't have that access otherwise. And is that something that you encountered over there?
Absolutely.
While you were there?
Motorcycle taxing is transformed infrastructure. Roads wash away completely. So whole communities, whole regions of the country are unreachable and impassable from Monrovia, in the capital, to more rural and outlying areas during the very long rainy season, which lasts from about March to about November. So I'm planning a trip soon. I know that we're really struggling to get me to the east of the country. Yeah, sure. And motorcyclists changed all of that. They made communities that were otherwise, unconnected, connected. So that's just a huge thing when it comes to so many dynamics, social, political, and economic. But that also amplifies dangers. So because they're such impassable roads, imagine 8 hours on an incredibly washed out, muddy road with potholes the size of craters. It's a young man's game, and mostly, as I said before, a man's game. But young motorcyclists have high prevalence of sterility because of so much time spent on bumpy roads. They face, burns.
Like meaning exactly what I think you mean by that, right?
Yeah,
Wow.
that impacts upon their sterility over a long period of time. That level of jolt to their body on bumpy roads. And eye injuries, limb injuries, and roadside accidents. Vigilante violence is also a massive threat, because when there's a roadside accident, there can be informal and vigilante justice delivered on site. And motorcyclists are both perpetrators of that violence and victims of it. So it could be that they're involved in an accident with the car, and it just depends on numbers. So they're accused of swarming to the site of accidents, and they do often, but they understand that a form of collective self-defense. But often that gets out of hand. So a big challenge is about how to reduce vigilante violence on both sides, and also to educate the police and the public that motorcyclists are not always the perpetrators of that. They're frequently on the receiving end of that same kind of violence if the vehicle owners and their friends or community members outnumber the cyclist, just dependent on the circumstances of the accident.
Wow. It sounds like in terms of community development and relationships with the police, the U.S. Motorcycling community could probably take a lot of notes from Liberia.
Yeah, maybe.
So I want to go back a little bit to the concept of post-war conflict and ex-combatants. And you had talked a little bit about the vocabulary that they use, the language that they use to describe what it is that they're doing. And I'm curious about the language. I mean, is there a technical difference between an ex-combatant and a veteran?
Yeah, veteran is a label, tends not to be used so much in Liberia, but I have experience in other post-war contexts, and the language is political. Sometimes in my research, I sort of abuse the distinctions between them to draw attention to the fact of different assistance regimes and different societal perceptions around who ex-fighters are in our communities and our polities, like in our countries. So I use the expression, our veterans, their combatants, to draw attention to the idea that in, say, Canada, the United States, and the UK, we're quite used to veterans being respected parts of the community, members of the community, and being entitled to long-term financial support from the state. And that this is the opposite of the message that the United Nations and its partners preach when it comes to quote unquote ex-combatants, regardless of the political circumstances of the war. Keeping in mind that individuals that fought on the side of the rebel movements understood themselves in not dissimilar terms from, say, Revolutionary War fighters or Union soldiers during the Civil War in the United States, as fighting for their security and fighting for a more just country. But regardless of the political undertones of any conflict, the default position discursively, or in terms of language and also assistance, that the UN, the World Bank, and others come in, is that these guys are bad guys and they need to be helped a little bit to buy peace in the short term, and then they need to go away. And they need to no longer even identify as ex-combatants, even to the point that in Liberia, the United Nations expected the president of the country to deliver a speech at the end of formal DDR programs, disarmament, demobilization, or reintegration, to give a speech in which she declared that use of the word ex-combatant would no longer be uttered. And of course,
Wow.
and part of that is out of an aspiration to heal and to come together and to not think so much along those divisions or identity lines. But part of it is also incredibly stigmatizing, and also kind of lets communities off the hook, because these combatants don't come from nowhere. They're, of course, combatants and fighters are produced by communities. So the idea that a community is somehow innocent I don't quite accept. Either that community failed to protect their children from recruitment, or the community believed that mobilization and recruitment was their best shot at a brighter future, but in either case, they were quite complicit and not absolved of responsibility in the war.
Right. And it's
So,
also the UN sort of imposing their language onto this country that is trying to rebuild
yeah.
in a way that is best for them and best for their
And
citizens.
that's fascinating too. That's such a good point, because it's interesting that some of the social cleavages and disputes are really around post-war language that's kind of
Mm,
brought in from outside, around ex-combatanthood versus non-ex-combatants. And interestingly, very rarely are you hearing about the factional identities and differences. And so that's around notions of who was helped by the UN and who wasn't, or ideas about were ex-combatants helped too much and more innocent community members helped less. Liberia adds even extra layers to that I don't have to go into in depth, but it had very lax eligibility onto the assistance programs. And so a number of non-combatants, tens of thousands of non-combatants, access programs that were designed for combatants.
wow.
So
Okay.
it adds an extra irony that ex-combatants are kind of vilified for receiving that assistance, but plenty of non-combatants were able to access it too, which is
Yeah.
supposed to be the goal, is to kind of help both communities and combatants. But there are tons of other contexts in which in which over time, communities that used to be referred to by elites or by regular people as ex-combatants start to claim the language of veteranship, because that language is frequently, at least in English-speaking communities, associated more with the cause was just, or this individual deserves long-term support and respect.
Right.
And so, yeah, there are contexts like that too, that in terms of the language, though, that hasn't quite happened in Liberia. And it really is taboo still to kind of disclose ex-combatant status, even though most people in the immediate proximity of that individual will know exactly what the background is. But they might
Interesting.
not always want to disclose that status in an interview, for example. So I had to pay attention to when they were using kind of coded language that disclosed that they probably were a child soldier or an ex-combatant, but just are kind of uncomfortable talking about it. That's another way in which Edwin stands out, because he was always very forthright and very happy to, like, felt that it was very important to talk about these things, to kind of establish himself as someone that matters in society, and someone that was both victim and perpetrator, but gets treated only as perpetrator, or that the war continues to impact on him, and that it's okay to talk about that.
Yeah, so that sounds like something for people to look forward or look for when they're watching the film. Is, when does this coded language come about? What are the signs that people have this background and maybe don't want to talk about it? And so that's a really interesting sort of
And
way.
you also see in the film, well, this probably doesn't spoil too much. It's not like it's not a whodunit, but a much younger writer, 18, who wouldn't have fought in the war at all, and he kind of starts to say that these differences don't matter anymore. That you have all different types from all different backgrounds at the taxi rank at Best Man Corner. But then he replicates the same divisions and saying, well, but we do have ex-combatants and we have students. And if you're an ex-combatant, you tend to behave like an ex-combatant. If you're a student, you behave like a student. And so even within this community of so-called trust and camaraderie, there are still the divisions, or the kind of those stereotypes creep back in.
Right. Yeah, and so you talk a bit, especially in your writing, about reintegration and the importance of reintegration and the difficulties and barriers that ex-combatants have to doing so. Can you tell me a little bit about, why is it important to reintegrate, and is it something where ex-combatants should be reintegrating and, I guess, in a way, sort of blending in with social society? Versus should they be embracing these ideals that they had when they went into the war in the first place? And is there, I don't know, a dichotomy between the two?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's going to vary from context to context. So I'll root this mostly in Liberia, but again, a little bit in terms of my familiarity with how the UN speaks about these issues, but maybe how I see it. So the classic explanation as to why should we reintegrate ex-combatants mostly boils down at the UN level to threat. That if you don't, then these are the most armed, the most trained, and the most likely individuals to spoil a peace process, or to lead a country back to conflict, or to use violent means to get what they want. Over time, I've tried in my research to break each one of those assumptions down, and to demonstrate how none of those tends to play out exactly as they're scripted by that language in actual post-conflict communities and contexts. That we don't see countries go back to war because of ex-combatant dissatisfaction with the previous war. That it's interesting that even in the classic example of, say, Weimar Germany and veterans being dissatisfied and therefore joining the Nazi Party, or we could think about the Capitol riots in the United States, for example, that veterans aren't monolithic. We know that there are also millions of veterans in the United States context that found those actions abhorrent, and that found that to be a dereliction of oaths taken, that sort of thing. So I think that there's an obligation for white outsiders to pay particular attention to how those ideas and assumptions might replicate racism, and might replicate problems with tending to see conflicts out there as being about nothing. But our contexts somehow have this rich political and difficult issues to resolve. So my reasons as to why reintegration might be necessary and important are a little bit different. And part of that's from a humanitarian perspective, and in part acknowledges the fact that that communities produce combatants, or that failed to protect them from being recruited. And so therefore those same communities, not just the international community, owes something to those individuals in terms of being able to transition back to civilian life, that will pose particular socioeconomic, but also socio-psychological challenges. And then from there, I think it's a political imperative to conceive of political reintegration, not in terms of invisibility or disappearing, but as full participation in society, including sometimes in troublemaking or in terms of protesting. And that's something that's incredibly important for social and political reintegration too. On the social side, it's really, to me, and it's sort of my critical talks that I give on this topic, it's to think that in Canada or the United States, for example, it's completely unremarkable to acknowledge that a core part of an individual's transition back from the military into civilian life or back from war is to build relationships with their fellows who can understand what it is that they're going through. Whereas then, if we think about a post-war context in Liberia, the message from the UN is often break chains of command, that any association between ex-combatants is threatening to the society. Whereas the individuals themselves see it in very similar terms to the way in which American vets or Canadian vets see the situation, that they rely on each other for support, that's social psychological support, but they also rely on each other for tips about where to set up a bank account, how to get a job, who's hiring, which area might be important, how to get set up in the motorcycle taxi business, which often involves things as simple as, can you teach me how to ride? Can you get me access to a bike? So they rely on those networks, just like our veterans do. And so that I hope is something that comes across on the social side too, about what social reintegration actually is, that it often paradoxically entails and necessitates relations with that are lateral relations with other ex-combatants.
Wow. So what you're saying is that we're all human.
Yeah, absolutely.
Crazy.
Nuts.
Yeah. So, oh man, so many more questions, but I do want to go back to the film really quickly, a little bit to the technical side of things. So filmmaking is relatively new for you, and it sounds like you had a good cinematographer there with you, but how did you prepare for making this film, given that your background isn't something outside of filmmaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, how would you like me to approach that? Is that more narratively, or is that something you want to anchor to Best Man Corner in particular?
Well, I'm kind of curious. We have a lot of people here, a lot of people who enter this film festival who are new filmmakers, who are first-time filmmakers, or a lot of people watching who just want to make their own first film. So I guess from a technical standpoint, how did you go about learning what you would need to do in order to execute a film in the first place?
Yeah, relying on a really good cinematographer and a really good editor is the key for a first-time filmmaker, and being able to use Edwin's language, to hustle to get it. So in terms of the editing, and I think Tanya Shangan did an excellent job in editing Best Man Corner, and she also edited a couple of other films in the short film series on everyday peace in Liberia that I did, one about women's peace activists called Peace Hut. She edited Pink Panther. She also edited a film that I have, if anyone's interested, called Silkies, which is about a group in the United States called Irreverent Warriors who do these underwear hikes, men and women, all branches, to prevent veteran suicide, not to raise awareness about it, but to actually prevent it, because they believe that being together in their military issue underwear helps to prevent that. But anyway, she did such a gorgeous job of that too. So I think it's finding an editor that's skilled technically and that is a true collaborator, that you can give your own direction to and trust that they'll implement that, but that will also take their own risks and push back a little bit, or just experiment with something a little bit different. Because most of my favorite moments in all of the films are often things that she thought of that weren't on my mind at all. Going into it, I think it's having a sense of not so much narrative structure and not being too wed to that, especially in a documentary sense, because I like to be guided by something, again, from the research world, a scholar named Veena Das, who does a lot of work on violence in deeply divided societies. And she often talks about going into any work with a gesture of waiting. So I think that will resonate with documentary filmmakers too, that you don't go in with the story already in mind. You have an inkling, but you want to be guided by participants and subjects as to what kind of form that story takes. You want to fall down some rabbit holes. You want to immerse yourself in the language that participants use themselves. So I think Matthew and I, in setting out, we had some general ideas, that is kind of about my history and foreknowledge of the sector. We knew we wanted to focus kind of on the social, on the political, on the legacy of conflict, and on this interplay between opportunity and challenge. That from there, hopefully, we let the language and some of the things we discovered in sight guide then how those issues get framed. We talked a lot about color, mainly on the technical side, and about movement, and about there are some key things that are tough, especially when you're working with a culture that speaks English and speaks English very well, quote unquote traditional or American English, but that also speaks Liberian English, which can be more or less discernible to an outsider. Mm-hmm. So we had fewer opportunities to just mic up a bunch of people and let them just interact and talk, because that would create particular translation challenges. And we didn't always have the resources for that. It would involve actually a pretty massive budget for translation alone. Yeah. So we needed to create a sense of community and flow from kind of more conventional methods of interviews, and still also did a lot of kind of deep hanging out, but with individuals to kind of observe them in their space, but still us interacting with them. So what we feel we lost out dialogically, we gained hopefully kind of an ambiance about place. And we thought if we grounded this particular film to the sense of this place, why is it called this? What's it about? What activities take place here? What kind of place is it? And mostly stay there, but then also follow Edwin to his home life to give a sense of what it's for. That would help us get around some of those issues. So. Right. Maybe that hits a couple spots in the question you asked, but I'm sure any person that's trying to make films could probably talk about this for hours.
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole festival dedicated to it. So. Yeah. And then, are you a writer yourself? It sounds like you have not yet gotten into that.
Oh, writer. Yeah, no, I know, terrible. Yeah, and. So Matthew did some writing in the film. I did no writing in the film. And that's partly having to direct. And it's kind of hard to direct from the back of a motorbike. And partly, again, to do with maybe the fact that our film then comes from a university and a Scottish research funding council, a grant providing body, which then has a whole layer of insurance and risk assessment. So we did have permission to ride and we had helmets. But for risk assessment reasons, we were encouraged not to ride long distances, so very short distances. And this next trip might actually be my first chance, because we're really struggling because it's still kind of the tail end of the rainy season. So it looks like I'm going to get to try my non-existent skills. As a little kid, my dad always rode on motorcycles. And I grew up as you can maybe hear, or not in Scotland, but in Utah. And so that was kind of, as a kid, it seemed like some intense verticals that I was navigating with him. I fell off more than a few times with him, and have deep memories of very hot equipment of the motorcycle searing into my 6-year-old flesh. So I think that has kind of made me a little bit averse, but I like the vibe enough, and I'm dedicated to this community enough that I hope I get a few opportunities, even if it's just from the hotel to the conference center in Monrovia. It's time. It's time for me to.
It definitely sounds like it's time. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. I want to give everyone a chance to ask questions, Caius, if there are any questions from the group. But in the meantime, while we wait for the questions to come in, I guess trying to figure out which question to ask first. One is, how can people support this motorcycle taxi community in Monrovia, in Liberia, around the world? Like, what can people do to get involved?
Wow. I mean, I love that. I should have done more thinking around that. One thing, and the reason why I made the films is really around these issues that we've been talking about. The cyclists really, and this doesn't just come from me because it's something I was interested in, they really do foreground social stigmatization and I think as our conversations make clear, these are kind of shared struggles. So it really is kind of taking these, even if it's at a dinner party with someone that works for the UN or someone that works for what's Canada's development agency? I should know this. Like your version of USAID.
Guys, help! I'm in the States.
I know. Yeah. Oh, okay. Then you have those kind of conversations, right? That kind of push back on these tendencies to see motorcyclists in a certain way. Beyond that, I do know, like the Federation of Motorcyclists and Tricyclists Unions in Liberia. So something that I was lucky to be able to support was called Foam Tool Hour. That's their acronym, Federation of Motorcyclists and Tricyclists of Liberia. Weekly radio broadcasts in which they shared messages that drew attention to issues like police brutality and exploitation of motorcyclists, accidents, vigilante violence, COVID-19 prevention, livelihood, and our funding's ran up for that. So if there's anyone that is interested in getting involved in supporting weekly radio broadcasts in Liberia, that's something that they are looking to continue. And I could give you some resources. You can go to my research page at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of St. Andrews. I have a page called Motorcycling as Peace Building, and it gives you a little bit of background, including the jingle that they wrote that's quite cool for the motorcycle shows. Beyond that, I'd have to give it some thought, but if people are interested, then we can always connect you directly to the associations and the local nonprofits that are doing really great work for them. Part of that could involve sponsoring a scholarship for a rider. Cool. So something that the government of Sweden has given me funding to pilot test is giving 15 scholarships to who are called chief riders. They're elected at each taxi rank for being the best riders at that particular taxi rank. And that they've said that when that person receives a scholarship, the educational attainment of the whole taxi rank tends to go up. So there's a bit of a halo effect. So we're interested in testing that. We don't know yet if the government of Sweden will then blow that out, but or expand that out. But I know reputable and excellent nonprofit organizations, and that would be able to sponsor scholarships for riders directly. If that's something that anyone was interested in, then I could work with them on that.
Well, it sounds like it's time to start planning a future Engines for Change fundraiser in collaboration with that.
That would be
perfect.
Phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to throw some of these resources up on the website at a bare minimum. So that's coming soon, everybody who's listening. And then, I guess my last question for you is, what's next? What's next for you? What's next in your projects? When is your next book coming out? All of that.
Yeah, so I am working on a book on the cyclists.
Shocking.
Who knows? I mean, I hope to write that next year, and hopefully that will go well. I am working on a feature. I mentioned that we had 6 key informants, and it's more down to resources and just the sheer difficulty of even putting out short films and wading through terabytes of material. The goal is always to highlight some of these other stories from other cyclists around the country that I interviewed, and so that's coming together. And so that feature I hope to complete next year. By that I mean it will probably end up being about 45 to 60 minutes as a documentary that explores the cycling lives of 4 other young men across the country. And then from there, I have these 3 grants from the Swedish government, the Scottish government, to the educational scholarships, and then we also are doing cross-border dialogue groups, young men and young women. When the young men, we mostly recruited from motorcycling taxi ranks, the young women from market associations, to bring them together to talk about cross-border challenges and to establish how they're always already engaged in resolving those challenges on their own, to draw attention to that and to drive resources towards youth driven and youth led solutions rather than solutions that get kind of imposed from outside. So that project's ongoing, and that's the reason why I'm headed to Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sierra Leone in the next couple weeks.
So when you say cross-border, you mean the actual geographic borders between Liberia and, because there's a lot of conflict Guinea, happening, interborder,
a lot of legacies of regional conflicts, a lot of, and these days in particular, a lot of violence or exploitation by border police of young people, or because young people expect that they'll be exploited economically by border police who might demand a bribe to cross at the legal border crossing. They might cross at an illegal border crossing, which puts them more at risk of criminals or the young women, including some young women riders, especially in Guinea, of sexual violence. So that's something that these dialogue groups have focused on and brought attention to.
Great. Wow. So that's a lot.
Yeah.
Everyone watching in the future, please, stay tuned for all of this amazing stuff, amazing research and peace building that's going to be happening. I definitely want to put some information up on the Engines for Change website. So hopefully in the near future, you'll be able to find some resources there. Check out Jaremy's page. Can you please actually share it with everybody, how everyone can follow along with what you're working on?
Yeah, even if you just Google motorcycling as peace building and my name, then you'll be directed to my research page. You'll find it pretty easily.
Can you just say how to spell your name, because it is unique?
It is. There it is. So yeah, thanks, Mom. Mom did a lot of water skiing in the 70s, and she wanted to be different, and it worked. But it also means I'm very Googleable. So Jaremey McMullin, McMullin. And you can also find the other films that form part of the short film series on my research pages if you want to give any of those a watch, especially Pink Panther, which also involves the motorcycling community.
I'm definitely going to watch that one next. Jaremey, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot. I hope everybody else did as well. And I can't wait to see your future projects. And thank you. Everybody watch Best Man Corner. It's amazing. You'll continue to learn. It's a great way to familiarize yourself with what's happening around the world. So
really appreciate it. Thanks to the film festival. Thanks to you and to Engines for Change for hosting me, for selecting Best Man Corner. Really appreciate it.